The dazzling lights of Green Ranch Casino glared against Jeremy's anxious face as he hovered near the entrance. Gripping 3 fake chips in his sweaty hand, he scanned the crowd, every movement betraying his jittery nerves. He pushed through the revolving doors, surrounded by flashing machines and a constant murmur of gamblers hoping for a win. Moving toward the cashier with tense resolve, he laid the chips on the counter, silently willing them to pass inspection. The clerk examined them momentarily, giving Jeremy a heart-stopping pause before nodding and exchanging them for crisp $100 bills. Not waiting a second, Jeremy pocketed the money, spun on his heel, and beelined for the exit. He burst out the casino doors and dove into the passenger seat of a waiting car where Morikawa sat. Engine running. "Drive now," Jeremy shouted, adrenaline surging through him. As the tires squealed, Morikawa asked, "Did they catch you?" Jeremy only grinned and flashed the money, his eyes gleaming with triumph. They roared with laughter as the car disappeared into Las Vegas's neon haze, 2 unlikely criminals escaping into the night. This was only the beginning. Morikawa, a Japanese-American builder, hadn't come to Vegas to gamble but to find honest work in the booming construction scene of 2000. At the time, Las Vegas was growing fast, with casinos and hotels rising on every block. He started a modest contracting business, hiring laborers for small to medium jobs, driven by the city's unrelenting demand. One evening after a tough shift, Morikawa wandered into a pool hall for some relaxation. There, he met Jeremy Lewis, out of work, down on his luck, and burdened by a criminal past filled with forgery and drug offenses. Jeremy shared his struggles candidly, admitting no one would hire him due to his record. Despite Jeremy's history, Morikawa saw potential and offered him a job in his construction company. Jeremy accepted eagerly and surprisingly proved himself reliable and hard-working. As business picked up, so did their friendship, and the two worked side by side for years. But by 2004, Las Vegas's real estate bubble burst, crushing local construction firms, including Morikawa's. Jobs dried up, debts mounted, and Morikawa and Jeremy found themselves chasing work across state lines just to stay afloat. One day, while driving past a massive casino billboard showing a $5,000 chip, Morikawa's curiosity sparked. He glanced at Jeremy and asked, "Do you think making something like that would be hard?" Jeremy, who had once forged money, replied, "It's just plastic and paint, really." A seed was planted then, desperation giving birth to a dangerous idea. Morikawa rationalized that casinos robbed people every day, so maybe it was fair to take something back. Jeremy, thrilled to return to his roots, needed no convincing. Morikawa hesitated but eventually silenced his conscience, picturing his struggling family and crumbling finances. Their scheme began with collecting real chips from different casinos to study them. Each casino had unique designs, but the chips shared the same general materials and dimensions. Back in Morikawa's garage, they broke apart the chips, analyzing the layers and materials inside. They experimented with clay, acrylic, and plastic, trying to mimic the real thing. The goal was to replicate not just the look but also the weight and feel, critical for fooling casino staff. While they managed to match the appearance, the chips sounded different when dropped. That sound, too dense, too heavy, was a giveaway no matter how perfect the visual match. They tested over and over, but the fake chips always made a dull thud instead of a light plastic clink. Eventually, they admitted they couldn't perfectly recreate the chips from scratch. But instead of giving up, Morikawa had another idea. Why not upgrade a real low-value chip into a high-value one? Their target became the $1 chip from Green Ranch Casino, which had nearly the same physical characteristics as the $100 version. If they could strip the center label, repaint it, and add a new number, they might fool the system. Boiling the chip loosened the adhesive on the center label, which they carefully removed. Then came the meticulous task of mixing paints to match the gray and black coloring of a $100 chip. Using spray paint for even coats and masking tape to recreate the chip's side markings, they slowly brought the illusion to life. The finishing touch was scanning and printing a replica of the original $100 label onto glossy plastic paper. For the final security detail, Morikawa used a UV pen to draw a tiny symbol, mimicking the casino's hidden watermark. With this, their first counterfeit $100 chip was complete. They created 3 of these fakes, planning to test them one at a time to avoid suspicion. Jeremy, being the bolder of the two, volunteered to carry them into the casino. He approached the cashier again, this time with a practiced ease, and handed over the fake chips. When the clerk exchanged them for $300 in cash, Jeremy felt the rush of victory. Back in the car, Jeremy was still grinning like a man who just pulled off the impossible. Morikawa kept glancing at him, stunned that their crazy experiment had actually worked. They had just scammed a major Las Vegas casino out of $300 with nothing more than doctored plastic and some clever paint. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to prove their plan could work. Morikawa drove through the glowing streets of Vegas, his thoughts bouncing between fear and exhilaration. "We actually did it," he kept muttering under his breath, still gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Jeremy held up the bills, waving them in the air like a trophy. "Dude, we're onto something huge," he said, unable to stop smiling. Once they got back to Morikawa's modest home in a quiet Vegas suburb, the two men went straight to the garage. That cluttered, dimly lit space had just become their secret headquarters. The workbench still had scraps of plastic, dried paint and paper stencils scattered across it. It smelled like paint thinner and dust, but to them it now smelled like opportunity. They immediately set out to replicate the process, speeding up production with each new chip. What had taken hours the first time was now being done in under 15 minutes. Morikawa handled the color matching, using his painter's eye from years in construction to perfect every shade. Jeremy, on the other hand, managed the labels and invisible UV markings, which he nailed thanks to his background in forgery. With each chip they completed, their confidence grew. They weren't just making fakes, they were crafting nearly flawless imitations. Still, they knew they couldn't keep hitting Green Ranch Casino over and over without raising suspicion, so they expanded their research and began visiting other major casinos across Las Vegas. They collected samples, $1 chips from places like Bellagio, MGM Grand, Caesar's Palace, and the Venetian. Some they acquired legally by gambling a bit, others they simply bought and took home to study. Each casino had its own color scheme and design patterns, but the basic form of the chip remained consistent. That consistency was the weak link, and they intended to exploit it. They created a chart on the garage wall marking each casino's color codes and side stripe placements. To an outsider it might have looked like a bizarre art project, but to them it was a blueprint for easy money. With the new chip designs, they could rotate through casinos and avoid hitting the same place twice in a row. Variety was key if they wanted to avoid detection. Once they had forged enough $100 and $500 chips, they revised their strategy. No longer would they walk in and cash out immediately. That was a rookie move. Instead, they'd gamble for a bit, just enough to look natural. Win a few hands, lose a few, and then quietly pocket the fake chips before heading to the cashier. That way, if security reviewed footage, they'd see typical behavior and assume the chips were obtained at the table. It gave them plausible deniability and bought them time. Jeremy's charisma came in handy during these outings. He played the part of a confident gambler perfectly, laughing, tipping dealers, and blending in with the high-roller crowd. Meanwhile, Morikawa rarely went in anymore. He knew his nerves couldn't handle it, and besides, Jeremy was better suited for the job. While Jeremy handled the front lines, Morikawa stayed in the garage fine-tuning the chips. He obsessed over details, making sure every fake was indistinguishable from the real thing. Soon their operation expanded beyond just $100 chips. They started forging higher denominations, $500, $1,000. The payout for a single chip was enormous. Imagine handing someone a sliver of plastic and getting a stack of cash in return. That's the magic trick they were pulling off. With more money came more risk, but also more comfort. Morikawa's family started noticing the sudden change in lifestyle. His wife, previously accustomed to budgeting every grocery trip, now found herself being taken to fancy dinners. His daughters were getting new clothes and toys almost every week. She asked him once where the money was coming from. Morikawa gave a rehearsed answer about landing a big renovation contract with a wealthy client. At first she looked skeptical, but then the gifts kept coming, and the questions stopped. She didn't want to disrupt whatever was fueling this sudden fortune. Meanwhile, Jeremy took his newfound wealth to the extreme. He rented out luxury suites on the Strip, indulging in wild parties that lasted for days. Bottles, women, drugs. Jeremy lived like a rock star. He was burning through cash faster than they could print it. Morikawa didn't approve, but he didn't stop it either. As long as Jeremy showed up with cash and didn't get them caught, he figured it wasn't his business. But things began to unravel one night when Jeremy showed up to the garage, clearly distressed. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "I messed up," he said, barely meeting Morikawa's eyes. "I told someone, a girl, about everything." Morikawa's face went pale. "You did what?" Jeremy explained he'd been trying to impress a woman he'd met during one of his binges. He thought if he told her about their scheme, she'd see him as some kind of mastermind. Instead, she saw a payday. She started demanding money to keep her mouth shut, $10,000 or she'd go to the police. Morikawa was furious, pacing the garage in disbelief. "Even my wife doesn't know, and you told a random girl from a bar?" They paid her the $10,000, hoping it would be enough to keep her quiet. But a few days later, she came back demanding even more. This time, Morikawa handled it. He told her it would be the last payment. No negotiations, no more money. She didn't like that answer, and what happened next set the wheels in motion for everything that followed. On April 3, 2005, Morikawa was at home when a well-dressed man knocked on the door. "Hey, sorry to bother you," the man said casually. "My kid tossed a ball into your yard. Mind grabbing it for us?" It was such a normal, neighborly moment that Morikawa didn't think twice. But as he turned to go fetch the ball, the man grabbed his arms and cuffed him. Seconds later, armed agents swarmed from around the property. They weren't neighbors. They were officers from the Nevada Gaming Control Board. These weren't your average cops. In a city like Las Vegas, where billions of dollars move through casinos every day, there are entire government units dedicated solely to policing gambling crimes. The agents had been investigating the counterfeit chip case for weeks. After a tip from the woman Jeremy had confided in, they began reviewing security footage across multiple casinos. They noticed a pattern: familiar faces, consistent betting behavior, and the same chips showing up again and again. Eventually, they connected the dots back to Jeremy and then to Morikawa. Inside Morikawa's garage, they found everything: the dies, the stencils, the printers, the forged chips. It was all laid out like a blueprint for fraud. The agents were stunned not just by the scale of the operation, but by the quality of the forgeries. Some chips were so accurate that even trained casino staff hadn't noticed. In total, they estimated Morikawa and Jeremy had passed nearly $1 million worth of counterfeit chips. It was a heist, but one executed not with guns but with glue, plastic and precision. Morikawa was arrested on the spot and booked into a high-security prison. A few days later, Jeremy was picked up as well. When they finally stood before a judge, their bail was set at an outrageous $5 million. Not even major drug traffickers usually saw bail that high. It was clear the courts weren't just punishing them, they were sending a message to anyone who dared mess with Vegas's cash cow. The casino industry wasn't just powerful, it was sacred. Morikawa couldn't afford the bail, so he sat in jail for weeks. But because he had no prior convictions, his defense attorney, a sharp, experienced criminal lawyer, filed for a reduction. It worked. The bail was dropped to $12,000 and Morikawa was released, while Jeremy, with a criminal history and outstanding warrants, remained behind bars. Outside of prison, Morikawa was now facing the harsh reality of mounting legal fees, a family to support, and no source of income. He had a taste of luxury, but now he was back to square one. With Jeremy still behind bars and the operation shut down, Morikawa found himself in a cold, uncertain reality. The excitement had vanished, and all that remained was pressure: legal, financial, and personal. The money he had stashed was drying up fast, drained by legal bills and daily expenses. He sold off some personal belongings, tools, electronics, even a few heirlooms to stay afloat. His wife started noticing the tension again, the way his smiles had grown hollow, and how often he avoided her questions. The fancy dinners stopped, the gifts became rare, and soon the lifestyle she'd come to enjoy began to slip away. Though he was free on bail, Morikawa knew he was walking on a razor's edge. Any mistake, any slip-up could land him back in prison, this time for good. He couldn't take jobs openly either. His name was now tainted in certain circles. The local contracting scene was small, and word about his arrest had traveled fast. One afternoon, while sorting through overdue bills, he remembered someone he never thought he'd call: the Russian inmate he'd met in jail. Back in prison, this guy had listened intently to Morikawa's story like it was a business pitch. He was well-connected, wealthy, and clearly not afraid of breaking the law. Desperate and boxed into a corner, Morikawa made the call. He figured if he couldn't work legally, maybe he could teach just once more. They met in a neutral location, a quiet diner far from the city. The Russian arrived dressed like a businessman, not a gangster, clean-cut, smooth-talking, but sharp-eyed. They spoke cautiously at first, dancing around the topic like two poker players feeling each other out. But it didn't take long before the Russian laid it out bluntly: "Teach us how to make the chips, we'll do the rest." Morikawa hesitated. He knew the danger of getting involved again, especially while his case was still active. But the debts kept whispering in his ear, and the offer, 25% of whatever profits they made, was too tempting to ignore. The deal was set. Morikawa wouldn't go near any casino. His only role was to teach the process. That way, if anything went wrong, he could claim ignorance. It felt like a loophole, like a way to stay just on the edge of the fire without getting burned. Training sessions began almost immediately, sometimes in Morikawa's own garage, other times in rented workshops or quiet warehouses on the outskirts of town. He taught them everything: the painting techniques, how to scan and print the center labels, how to match the UV mark with a special pen. It was like passing down a dark art. But despite his detailed instruction, the Russians didn't have his eye for detail. Their first batches were close, but not close enough. The paint was off by a few shades, the stripe placement slightly crooked, or the weight just a bit too light. In a casino, those small flaws could mean instant exposure. Still, they pressed on. They figured good enough was good enough, and began putting the chips into circulation. They followed the same strategy Jeremy had used: gamble casually, act normal, then cash out. At first it seemed to work. The money started flowing again, and Morikawa received his share. It wasn't as much as before, but it was enough to stop the financial bleeding. His lawyer's payments resumed, and the house stayed afloat. For a while it felt like the storm had passed. But then came the slip-up. A dealer at one of the casinos noticed something odd. The color of a $500 chip didn't match the others on the table. It was subtle but enough to raise eyebrows. He reported it to his supervisor, who sent the chip to the security team for further inspection. Under UV light and with magnification tools, they confirmed it was a fake. Word spread fast. The casino contacted the gaming control board, and a new investigation kicked off immediately. Agents began collecting surveillance footage, tracing the chip's path from the table back to the player who'd cashed it in. That player was tied to others, and soon they realized this wasn't a lone wolf, it was a group. More chips were seized from various casinos, each one traced back to the same network. The investigators noticed that the counterfeiting style resembled a previous case, the one involving Morikawa. But this time, there was no footage of Morikawa in any of the casinos. He'd been careful, never stepping inside, always staying in the shadows. Still, suspicions began to rise. How could this new group replicate the chips so closely unless they had inside knowledge? Morikawa's name surfaced again. The gaming control board couldn't prove his involvement yet, but they started watching him closely. They followed his movements, tracked his phone records, and eventually tailed a few known Russian gang members. That's when they hit the jackpot. Agents watched as several members of the gang pulled into Morikawa's driveway. They stayed for hours and left carrying unmarked boxes. That was enough. The authorities got a warrant and prepared for a raid. One morning, as Morikawa was in his garage fine-tuning another batch of chips, he heard a loud knock on the door. "Open up, law enforcement." He froze. His hands were covered in paint, and counterfeit chips lay drying on the workbench in front of him. There was no time to hide anything. The agents stormed the house, guns drawn, sweeping through every room. Within minutes, Morikawa was in cuffs again, standing helpless in his driveway as neighbors peeked through their curtains. It felt like déjà vu, but worse. This time he wasn't caught experimenting or dabbling, he was caught mid-operation, surrounded by evidence. The agents confiscated everything: printers, scanners, paint cans, labels, and the chips themselves. The whole operation was exposed. Back at the station, Morikawa sat silently in the interrogation room. He knew the routine, but this time his hope was thinner than ever. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was already out on bail for a previous offense. Any leniency he once had was in serious jeopardy. Still, his attorney showed up again, the same sharp defense lawyer who had gotten him out before. The man looked frustrated but not surprised. "I told you to stay clean," he muttered. "Now we've got a real mess." The case moved quickly through the courts. Morikawa pleaded guilty to 6 charges, mostly related to counterfeiting, conspiracy, and fraud. But somehow, against all odds, the lawyer worked his magic again. He argued that the full extent of the operation couldn't be proven. In the end, the judge ruled that the confirmed amount of fake chips tied directly to Morikawa totaled just 36,000. That number was a fraction of what the operation had likely produced. Estimates exceeded 1 million. Instead of prison, Morikawa was sentenced to 5 years of probation and community service. No jail time, just a long leash with a short collar. For the second time, he dodged the full consequences of his actions. But the message was clear: one more slip, and it would all come crashing down. As for the chips still in circulation, many were never found. Casinos unknowingly continued to use them, mixing the fakes with the real ones without realizing. The craftsmanship had been that good. Even the gaming control board admitted they couldn't always tell them apart. But the scam had done more than embarrass the industry. It forced them to evolve. In the months following the case, casinos began embedding RFID chips into every casino token. These chips carried data: denomination, location, serial number, and could be scanned at tables and cash-out counters. It made forgery almost impossible. And it was all because of one man, a construction worker turned forger, who exposed the system's biggest flaw. Ironically, his crimes made casinos safer for everyone else. After the second arrest and a sentence that felt more like a warning than punishment, Morikawa returned home with a different energy. The weight of knowing he'd come inches from losing everything this time haunted him. He was free, but not really. Probation meant the law hovered over his every step like a shadow, ready to strike at the slightest misstep. Gone were the flashy dinners and shopping sprees. His wife, now more skeptical than ever, watched him carefully, sensing there was more to the story than he let on. Morikawa tried to maintain a low profile, sticking to a routine that would bore even the nosiest neighbor. His days were spent doing community service, cleaning up roadsides, painting fences, handing out meals at shelters. These public tasks were humiliating at times. Passers-by who once envied his apparent success now saw him wearing a reflective vest and picking up trash. His daughters asked questions he didn't have the heart to answer. He dodged them with vague answers about helping the community or paying things forward. At night, when the house was silent and the city lights flickered in the distance, he'd lie awake thinking about the choices that brought him here. How greed had tangled with desperation and led him down a path he never thought he'd walk. And yet, a part of him still admired the craftsmanship, the precision, the art of creating something so convincing that billion-dollar institutions couldn't tell the difference. But he knew he couldn't go back. Not now. One more slip and there'd be no lenient sentence, no clever lawyer to save him. Jeremy, meanwhile, had finished his prison term and was released months later. Their reunion was awkward. Jeremy looked rougher, aged by prison time, harder around the eyes. He hadn't lost his charm, but something in him had changed. They met for coffee one afternoon, avoiding eye contact for the first few minutes. The air between them felt heavy with unfinished business. "I heard you got off again," Jeremy finally said, smirking. "You've got 9 lives, man." Morikawa shrugged, taking a slow sip. "Yeah, but I think I used up most of them already." Jeremy leaned in, lowering his voice. "I was thinking, we could pick things up again, you and me, old times." Morikawa stared at him, stunned that he'd even suggest it. "Are you out of your mind? You just got out. I'm on probation." But Jeremy wasn't one to quit easily. "Think about it. We made something that shook the system. We were good at it." Morikawa shook his head and stood up, tossing some bills on the table. "We got lucky. Don't mistake that for invincibility." And just like that, he walked away, cutting off the conversation before it turned into something dangerous. He didn't look back. Weeks turned into months, and Morikawa settled into a rhythm. He took small handyman jobs under the table, just enough to keep the lights on. He avoided casinos entirely, not just out of fear but guilt. The sights and sounds of gambling reminded him of what he nearly lost. But Las Vegas was an unforgiving city. Temptation was built into its architecture, on every billboard, in every blinking light, every fake smile behind a blackjack table. Even while living clean, Morikawa couldn't escape the whispers. Former associates still sent feelers his way, asking for help, offering cash under the table for advice on chip designs. He turned them down every time. The temptation was there, but he resisted. That resolve was tested one night when a man showed up uninvited at his doorstep. He didn't give a name, but his expensive shoes and slick demeanor said enough. "I know who you are," the man said calmly, "and I know what you're capable of." Morikawa stayed silent, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "I'm not interested," he said before the man could go further. But the stranger wasn't easily dismissed. "It's not about interest, it's about legacy. You built something they're still talking about inside those casinos." Before leaving, he handed Morikawa a card. It was blank on one side. The other had a phone number and nothing else. For days, the card sat on his kitchen counter, untouched. Every time he walked past it, he felt like it whispered to him. But he didn't call. He shredded it on the 5th day and threw it away with the rest of the week's garbage. Still, the incident rattled him. His past wasn't just something that happened. It had become a reputation. And in Vegas, reputations have a way of sticking. Meanwhile, the casinos weren't sitting idle either. The scam had triggered a massive overhaul in their internal security systems. By now, nearly all casinos had implemented RFID chips into their tokens. These chips weren't visible to the naked eye, but could be scanned to verify authenticity instantly. If a counterfeit didn't have that chip embedded, it would be flagged immediately at the table or cashier. It was a high-tech defense built specifically because of people like Morikawa. In a way, it was a strange badge of honor. His con had been so effective it forced billion-dollar corporations to change the way they did business. But for Morikawa, that recognition came with a price. He couldn't step foot inside a casino again, even as a guest. He was blacklisted, his face shared across internal networks, flagged in every surveillance system across the Strip. Cameras would identify him within minutes. His probation officer reminded him of that regularly. "Set foot inside one of those places, and your next home's going to have iron bars." So Morikawa stayed away. But Vegas is small when you're trying to keep your head down, and reminders of the past were everywhere. Every now and then he'd hear rumors. Someone tried to replicate the scam. A new crew was caught with fake chips. Some even claimed to have learned the technique from a guy who knew the original mastermind. He'd hear his name come up in whispers, half respectful, half cautionary. He was becoming a myth, one people spoke about in hushed tones in shady corners of the gambling world. But myths don't pay bills. Morikawa kept working odd jobs, fixing fences, patching drywall, installing cabinets. The work was honest, but the pay was light. Some nights he'd go to bed hungry just to make sure his kids didn't. Despite everything, he held on to that routine. Even after all the money, the schemes and the close calls, he found a strange peace in living simply. He knew now that chasing shortcuts only led to longer consequences. He'd been lucky to get out twice. Others weren't so lucky. He'd read about former acquaintances getting arrested, some locked up for decades. One night he stumbled on a documentary about casino fraud. They covered several big scams, marked cards, inside dealers, chip swaps. And then, almost casually, they brought up his name. One of the most creative counterfeiting schemes ever uncovered, the narrator said. They didn't show his face, but they described the scam in detail. It exposed a flaw so deep in the casino system, it changed how chips are designed nationwide. Morikawa turned off the TV and sat in silence. For a moment, he didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed. Eventually, he settled on neither. It was just something that happened, something he did, and something he'd never do again. He looked out his window at the glowing skyline of Las Vegas. It used to look like opportunity. Now it just looked like a warning. The days continued to crawl forward, but something inside Morikawa had shifted permanently. He wasn't just done with the scam. He was done with the kind of thinking that ever made it seem like a good idea. He still carried the weight of it all like an invisible scar, etched deeper by regret than punishment. It wasn't the time behind bars or even the courtroom drama that had changed him. It was watching his family live through the fallout. Every awkward silence from his wife, every question from his daughters he couldn't answer, they lingered far longer than any sentence. In the end, the emotional toll was a worse prison than any cell. The community service hours piled up like slow-burning penance. Sometimes he scrubbed graffiti, other times he was assigned to clean up along the freeway with a trash claw and safety vest. It was humbling, thankless work, but it was real, and in its own quiet way, it was healing. He began to notice the small things, birds landing on street signs, kids laughing in passing cars, the slow rhythm of the desert wind brushing through the trash-strewn roadside. Life wasn't flashy, but it was honest again. In some moments he wondered what life could have been if he'd just kept his head down during the downturn. Maybe they would have lost the house, maybe the bills would have stacked up, but at least he wouldn't have lost his peace. Still, he knew those thoughts wouldn't change the past. All he could do was keep putting one foot in front of the other and try to earn back some dignity. He started to take pride in the simple jobs again. Fixing a broken sink, patching drywall, replacing a screen door, little things that helped people, even if they didn't pay much. Word of mouth got around that Morikawa was dependable. Quiet guy, but he does good work, one customer said to another, and slowly the calls trickled in. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and more importantly, it gave him a reason to get up each morning. Still, his past wouldn't entirely let him go. Every once in a while, someone would recognize him. "Hey, you're that guy, right? The one with the chips?" they'd ask, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Morikawa would nod vaguely, give a tight smile, and move the conversation along. He had no interest in revisiting his outlaw days like some kind of folklore hero. The truth was, the story had taken on a life of its own. Internet forums, YouTube channels, even local legends in Vegas bars told twisted versions of what happened. Some claimed he'd stolen millions and vanished into Mexico with Jeremy. Others said he faked his arrest and went to work for the casinos as a chip security consultant. None of it was true, of course, but Morikawa didn't bother correcting anyone. Sometimes it was better to let the myth run wild. He stayed in touch with Jeremy now and then, mostly through short texts or occasional phone calls. Jeremy had moved out of state, hoping for a fresh start somewhere less neon-soaked. They talked about regular things now, weather, family, random memories from their construction days. The scams rarely came up. One night, Morikawa received a message that gave him pause. Jeremy had written, "Ever think about how close we were to pulling it off forever?" He stared at the screen for a long time before replying, "Yeah, and I also think about how close we were to losing everything forever too." Jeremy didn't respond after that. Maybe he got the message, maybe he didn't, but for Morikawa, it was closure. Meanwhile, the casinos had made major overhauls to their systems. RFID tech was now embedded in every chip, invisible but unmistakable. They'd also hired specialized security consultants to train staff on chip handling and detection. It wasn't just about fake chips anymore, it was about reinforcing trust in the entire gambling ecosystem. Morikawa watched this transformation from afar with mixed feelings. In a strange way, he had been the catalyst for progress. He'd broken the system, not to destroy it, but to survive it, and in doing so forced it to evolve. That irony sat with him often. But there were no rewards for that kind of innovation. No patents, no parades. Instead, he was a name in a file, a cautionary tale casinos used in staff training. Don't be fooled. If it happened once, it can happen again. In time, he found some peace in normalcy. It came slowly, like the way scars fade, not overnight, not all at once. He and his wife started talking more, honest talks about money, about fear, about mistakes and second chances. She never quite forgave him completely, but she stood by him, and in the quiet moments that was enough. Their daughters were older now, and while they didn't know all the details, they sensed the struggle beneath the surface. They saw their dad come home tired but present, worn down but trying. To them, that mattered more than how much money was in the bank. They didn't need luxury, they just needed him. In the background, Las Vegas continued spinning. People came and went. Fortunes were won and lost. The strip buzzed like a machine that never shut off. And somewhere among it all, Morikawa existed like a footnote. A man who once outsmarted a billion-dollar industry with craft paint and a printer. There were nights he still dreamed about it. The adrenaline, the perfect forgery, the quiet thrill of holding something fake that looked more real than reality. But when he woke up, he shook those dreams off like dust and went back to patching drywall. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Sometimes, while waiting in line at the grocery store or sipping gas station coffee, he'd catch whispers behind him. People who'd heard a version of the story, pointing quietly, unsure if it was really him. He didn't mind. He didn't confirm, didn't deny, just paid for his things and went on his way. The city never really forgets, but it eventually moves on. New scandals, new grifts, new headlines. And for Morikawa, that was fine. He'd had his moment, and it was more than enough. He spent his evenings now sitting on the porch, watching the desert sky change colors as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Sometimes he'd listen to old jazz records, letting the mellow tones bleed into the warm air. Other times he'd just sit in silence, grateful he still had a porch to sit on, that he hadn't lost his family, that he'd escaped just in time. There was a beauty and simplicity he'd never appreciated before. The scam had taught him that shortcuts may feel smart, but they rarely lead anywhere worth staying. The lesson cost him years of his life, but it gave him something to perspective, a clear line between need and greed. Now, when he saw casino billboards asking, "Are you ready to win big?" he'd chuckle to himself. Been there, done that, got the felony. The city of Las Vegas would always be a symbol of what had happened, but now it was also a reminder of what didn't happen. He hadn't lost everything. He hadn't become the monster the system tried to paint him as. He was just a man who made a terrible choice and then made better ones. That in itself was a kind of redemption. Even though the chaos was behind him, Morikawa sometimes felt like he was still being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was more like a hum in the background, a low vibration reminding him that he was never truly anonymous again. When he'd pass through certain parts of town or stop for gas near the strip, he felt eyes on him. Security cameras, retired pit bosses, even casino security who may have once studied his photo in training. He wasn't on any wanted list anymore, but his name lived on in internal memos and warning slideshows. To Vegas, he was part of the folklore, one of the rare few who'd actually gotten inside the system and shaken it. What surprised him, though, was how many people admired what he'd done, not in a "you're my hero" way, but with the kind of respect people reserve for those who outsmart giants. Taxi drivers, bartenders, even retired dealers would bring it up. "You were the guy with the fake chips, right? Man, you really got 'em good." He never admitted it, never denied it, just nodded vaguely and let the stories spin out of control on their own. He didn't want credit, he just wanted peace. But there was one person who wouldn't let go of the past, his old lawyer. The man had become something of a local celebrity in legal circles thanks to the case. He would call occasionally, usually after a few drinks, reminiscing about how they beat the system. Morikawa always let him talk but never indulged. "Could have made a documentary out of you," the lawyer once said over the phone. "I mean, the craftsmanship alone, those chips were art." Morikawa said nothing, just stared out his window at the Vegas skyline. The city looked beautiful from a distance, like a painting you should never touch. The call stopped after a while, probably for the best. Still, every now and then someone new would reach out. A cryptic email, an anonymous letter, even a phone call routed through multiple area codes. All asking the same thing. Could he teach them? Could he show them how it was done? He deleted every message, blocked every number, shredded every letter. He wasn't that man anymore. One letter in particular had come from out-of-state Canada. If the stamp was real, it was written in clean block letters and had no return address. Inside was just one sentence: "There's always another way to beat the house." He burned it in a metal trash can behind his garage, watched the paper curl, blacken and vanish into smoke. It wasn't just temptation that bothered him, it was legacy. He didn't want to be remembered as a scammer, even a successful one. He wanted to be known for something else, even if it was just being a man who turned things around, a man who made mistakes and chose not to make them again. So he doubled down on the life he had now. He took on more handyman jobs, slowly building trust with clients who knew nothing about his past. He volunteered at his daughter's school, helped build stage sets for the drama club's plays. The parents welcomed him with gratitude, completely unaware they were shaking hands with a man who once built Counterfeit fortune. He felt normal again. Piece by piece, every small good deed became a quiet apology to the world he once tried to cheat. But every now and then he'd see a story in the local news about someone trying a new casino con. Usually it was crude, marked cards, chip switching, or rigged slot machines. They never lasted long. Security these days was too tight, the tech too advanced. Yet every time it happened, he'd get that familiar chill down his spine. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. He'd mutter under his breath, "Amateurs," and go back to work. Still, it reminded him that others were always trying to do what he did and usually failing. One particularly bold scam made national headlines. A team had tried smuggling modified chips into a tournament poker event and were caught by RFID scanners at the cashier's desk. The chips looked flawless down to the color, texture and weight, but without that tiny embedded chip, they might as well have been poker night tokens from a dollar store. For a moment, he wondered if they had studied his methods. Maybe someone had picked up where he left off. But that moment passed, and with it, so did any sense of pride in his old work. There was no pride in deception, even clever deception. That was something he reminded himself every day. He started mentoring a few young men in his neighborhood, guys who were one mistake away from taking the wrong road. He didn't preach, didn't moralize. He just taught them how to build things. Cabinets, decks, sheds, fences. He showed them the value of precision, of patience, of honest skill. It was the same energy he used to counterfeit those chips, only now it was rebuilding instead of dismantling. One of them asked him once, "How'd you learn to do things so perfectly?" Morikawa smiled softly. "Let's just say I learned it the hard way." He saw his old self in them sometimes, the hunger, the edge, the fear of not being enough, and he hoped that by showing them another path he might rewrite a little of his own story through theirs. His wife noticed the change too. They started talking late into the evenings again, not about money or survival, but about life, the kids, and what came next. They had quiet dreams now, a small business maybe, a workshop of his own where he could teach and build and live simply. For the first time in years, it didn't feel impossible, it felt earned. One weekend they drove out of the city, no destination, just following the highway west. The strip disappeared in the rearview mirror, replaced by open desert and wide skies. They stopped at a small diner off Route 95, the kind of place where everyone has a story and no one asks too many questions. As they waited for their food, his wife reached across the table and held his hand. "You're different now," she said quietly. He nodded, unable to speak for a second. "I know. Took me long enough, huh?" She smiled. Better late than never. They ate pancakes and coffee, surrounded by strangers and silence. It felt like the beginning of something not flashy or thrilling, just real. On the drive back, his daughter leaned forward from the back seat and asked, "Dad, were you ever famous?" He met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Only for the wrong things," he replied. She blinked, confused. "Like what?" He paused for a beat. "Like making mistakes, but the good news is, I got really good at fixing things after that." She smiled and sat back, satisfied. In that moment, he knew he was finally steering in the right direction. It had been over a year since Morikawa's probation started, and he hadn't stepped out of line once. Every month he checked in on time, showed proof of work, and completed his community service hours without complaint. The parole officer, who at first treated him with suspicion, now spoke with a tone closer to respect. "Keep this up and you'll be off paper in no time," he once said with a nod. Morikawa only smiled, not because he wanted praise, but because he no longer needed approval from anyone. He was simply trying to live the kind of life that let him sleep at night. Meanwhile, Las Vegas moved on, as it always did. The old scandal was slowly pushed aside by new headlines, celebrity arrests, sports betting controversies, and cyber fraud rings. Morikawa was happy to be forgotten. He didn't want to be remembered as that guy with the chips anymore. Instead, he focused on his little world repair jobs, coaching youth volunteers and spending quiet weekends at home. The simplicity was exactly what he had once craved without realizing it. One summer morning, he got a call from an old acquaintance in the construction business. The man had heard Morikawa was working again and needed help with a remodeling project on the outskirts of town. Morikawa accepted without hesitation. It felt good to take on honest work without any second thoughts. The job site was an old ranch-style home being turned into a guest house. It was tucked far enough from the strip that you could forget Las Vegas even existed. He worked with a small crew, mostly younger guys in their 20s. They had energy, but not much experience. Morikawa quickly found himself in a leadership role again, not because he asked for it, but because he had knowledge that others respected. He showed them how to square corners properly, how to lay tiles evenly, how to listen to the building instead of forcing it. The project lasted 3 months, and when it wrapped, the owner thanked him personally. "You gave this place a second life," the man said, handing him a firm handshake and a thick envelope. Morikawa drove home that night, feeling something he hadn't in a long time: fulfillment. The money was decent, sure, but more than that, it was earned honestly, and no one would come knocking at his door because of it. At dinner, he handed the envelope to his wife. "We're finally catching up on bills," he told her, and this time it was true. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and told him she was proud. For once there were no unspoken doubts behind her eyes. Their daughters had grown into curious, clever teens. They sensed that their father had lived through something complex, but they didn't push for details. Morikawa gave them lessons in subtle ways. "If something feels too easy, it probably costs more than you think," he told them once while fixing a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink. They laughed at the time, but he saw the idea sink in behind their eyes. If he could pass anything down to them, it would be that: not how to game the system, but how to live without fearing it. One evening, he got a surprising message from Jeremy. Just a short text: "You still in town?" Morikawa hesitated for a moment before responding. "Yeah, you passing through?" They met the next day in a quiet cafe tucked behind a strip mall. It wasn't a reunion of best friends, more like two veterans crossing paths after the war. Jeremy looked healthier than before, sober, sharper, and dressed plainly. "I've been working freight," he said, sipping black coffee, "driving trucks through Utah and Arizona. Nothing glamorous, but it pays." Morikawa nodded. "Glamorous is overrated." Jeremy laughed. "Ain't that the truth?" They talked for nearly an hour, catching up on life, regrets, and roads not taken. Jeremy admitted he still had cravings for the old hustle, the rush, but he hadn't acted on them. "Sometimes I think about it though," he said, "how we pulled it off, how close we came." Morikawa didn't respond right away. He looked out the window and said, "And how close we were to losing everything." Jeremy gave a small nod. "Yeah, that part too." Before they parted ways, Jeremy pulled something from his wallet, a photo of his young son. "That's why I'm staying clean," he said, smiling with real pride. Morikawa looked at the picture, then back at his old friend. "Good, he deserves a whole version of you, not pieces." They shook hands and walked off in opposite directions, knowing that might be the last time they ever met, and maybe that was okay. As summer gave way to fall, life settled into an almost poetic rhythm. The handyman gigs kept coming, and word of Morikawa's quiet, dependable work spread further. One day he got a call from a local non-profit that helped recently incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. They had heard about him through whispers, referrals, maybe even someone who had read between the lines of his past. "We need someone to teach basic trades, carpentry, tile work, repairs. Nothing formal, just someone who knows what he's doing and isn't afraid to share it." Morikawa hesitated. "You sure I'm the guy for that?" The caller replied, "You're exactly the guy for that." He took the role, not for the money, it barely paid, but for the sense of building something bigger than himself. Every week he stood in front of 6 to 8 men, most fresh out of county jail, all trying to start over. He saw himself in their tired eyes, their guarded body language. He taught them how to measure twice and cut once, how to check for studs, how to listen to drywall as if it could speak. But more than skills, he taught patience, persistence, precision. And maybe, just maybe, redemption. One of the younger guys, a quiet 22-year-old named Lennox, stayed late after a class. "I know who you are," he said one day, carefully, almost apologetically. Morikawa didn't flinch. A lot of people do. Lennox looked embarrassed. I watched a video about your story online. I thought you were like some kind of legend." Morikawa exhaled, calm but firm. "Legends usually end up broke, locked up or dead. I got lucky." Lennox asked, "Do you regret it?" Morikawa looked at him, really looked. "I regret believing shortcuts could ever fix the long road, but I'm grateful I got a second chance to walk the road right." Lennox nodded slowly. "Thanks for not walking away." From that moment, something clicked between them. Morikawa realized he had something far more valuable to pass on than a scam. He had wisdom, the kind that comes at a cost, the kind that could keep someone else from stepping off a cliff just to see what the fall feels like. The class grew slowly but steadily. Word spread among halfway houses and community shelters that Morikawa wasn't just another guy lecturing from a podium. He actually listened. He kept the lessons hands-on and simple, fixing a door hinge, patching a wall, sealing a broken window. Each skill offered more than a paycheck, it offered dignity. Most of the men he taught had never had someone believe in them before. Morikawa didn't make speeches, he just showed up on time every week. One afternoon, after teaching how to install vinyl flooring, one of the older students stayed behind. He was quiet, had done time for fraud years earlier, and usually kept to himself. The man looked down at the floor he'd just laid and said, "You ever think the system doesn't want guys like us to get better?" Morikawa nodded slowly. "Yeah, but that's why we have to prove it wrong." It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about forward motion, small steps done right, over and over. For the first time in years, he saw value in his own mistakes, not because they made him famous, but because they made him useful to those walking the path behind him. His wife began volunteering with the non-profit too, helping with resume workshops and basic budgeting. Their daughters even joined on weekends, painting walls or handing out meals. The family that was once nearly torn apart by a lie was now helping rebuild others, not as heroes, just as people who had learned the hard way. Years passed and the legend of Morikawa's scam slowly faded into the background of Las Vegas history. The casinos were stronger now, harder to cheat, more aware. RFID chips, AI-powered surveillance and facial recognition had become standard. Morikawa often joked, "You'd have better luck robbing Fort Knox than faking a chip these days." But deep down he was glad the system got smarter, and even more relieved that he no longer had to run from it. He stayed with the non-profit, eventually helping to open a permanent trades training center on the east side of the city. His name wasn't on the sign, but his fingerprints were on every wall. Sometimes tourists would still spot him, older now, more grounded, and ask, "Aren't you the guy from that casino thing?" He'd smile and reply, "Used to be. Now I'm just a guy who fixes things." In many ways, that became his legacy. Not the chips, not the con, but the choice to rebuild something better. He had played the game and walked away, and in doing so proved that the house doesn't always win. Sometimes the ones who walk away with nothing end up richer than anyone inside. Today, Morikawa lives quietly in a modest home on the edge of town. The money's not crazy, the work isn't glamorous, but his life is finally his own. The garage where he once forged fake casino chips is now filled with tool racks, workbenches and student projects. It's a place of creation, not deception. Looking back, he doesn't pretend what he did was noble, but he also knows that people aren't defined by their worst choices, they're defined by what they do afterward. He still gets the occasional message from strangers, some asking for advice, others just saying thank you. He responds when he can, but keeps his life focused, quiet and honest. He didn't change overnight, but day by day, mistake by mistake, he became something new. Someone real. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next unbelievable true story we uncover. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Morikawa's shoes? Let us know, and as always, thanks for watching.